Jasmine Crockett stood tall at the congressional hearing, her purple blazer a stark contrast against the wood-paneled chamber, heart racing as the cameras zoomed in. Just moments earlier, Pam Bondi had unleashed a blistering attack, her voice echoing through the room. Congresswoman Crockett is incompetent and unfit for office. The chamber erupted, Republicans nodding vigorously, Democrats shouting objections, the committee chair struggling to maintain order. Crockett, gripping her documents tightly, eyes fixed and unwavering, didn't flinch as millions watched live. Bondi, former Florida Attorney General with decades of political experience, smirked confidently, certain she'd cornered the freshman representative from Texas. But Crockett, armed with her legal background and razor-sharp intellect, saw this moment for what it was. Not just an attack, but an opportunity to expose Bondi's deception on national television. And she calmly reached for the microphone, a slight smile crossing her face. This wasn't just another congressional hearing. This was about to become Jasmine Crockett's moment to turn Bondi's ambush into a historic takedown that would reverberate through the political world. Before we dive deeper into this explosive confrontation, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. You won't want to miss what happens next in this remarkable political showdown. The tension in the hearing room was palpable as the C-SPAN cameras panned across the chamber. Pam Bondi sat with perfect posture, her blonde hair immaculately styled, designer blazer accentuating her confident demeanor. The former Florida Attorney General had built her reputation as a fierce conservative defender, regularly appearing on right-wing media to advocate for traditional values and limited government. Today, she'd come as a special witness to the House Oversight Committee, ostensibly to discuss election integrity. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Bondi began, her voice carrying the polished tone of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms and press conferences. "I'm here today because Americans deserve the truth about what's happening in our elections." But it quickly became clear that Bondi had another agenda entirely. Rather than sticking to the hearing's stated purpose, she pivoted to a direct attack on several committee members, saving her sharpest barbs for Jasmine Crockett. "And Congresswoman Crockett," Bondi continued, her tone shifting to one of barely disguised contempt, "who comes here pretending to defend voting rights while her own district suffers. She's been in office for barely a year and has accomplished nothing except grabbing headlines and making inflammatory statements. The people of Texas deserve better than an inexperienced activist masquerading as a congresswoman." The Republican committee members nodded approvingly while Democrats began objecting loudly. The chairman gave repeatedly, struggling to maintain order as Bondi continued her unexpected assault. Across the chamber, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett remained surprisingly composed. The freshman representative from Texas had arrived at Congress after a different path than most. A civil rights attorney who had defended protesters and fought against voter suppression. Crockett had built her reputation in courtrooms, not cocktail parties. Her district had elected her precisely because she wasn't a traditional politician. She was a fighter who had stood up against powerful interests her entire career. What Bondi didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that Crockett had anticipated this ambush. For 3 days, her staff had gathered information on Bondi's record as Florida's Attorney General. They'd compiled a dossier on questionable decisions, conflicts of interest, and selective enforcement of laws that painted a very different picture than the righteous defender Bondi portrayed herself as. As Bondi continued her attack, Crockett calmly organized her documents. Her years as a trial attorney had taught her that responding with emotion was exactly what opponents like Bondi wanted. Instead, she would wait for her allotted time and then systematically dismantle Bondi's credibility piece by piece. The stakes couldn't be higher. This nationally televised hearing wasn't just about two strong personalities clashing. It was about the very foundation of who could claim to truly represent the people's interests. Was it Bondi, the polished political insider with powerful connections? Or Crockett, the outspoken advocate who had fought in the trenches for civil rights? The committee chairman finally restored order. "Miss Bondi, please confine your comments to the topic of today's hearing. Congresswoman Crockett, you'll have your 5 minutes for questions shortly." Crockett nodded respectfully, but those who knew her recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same expression she had worn in courtrooms just before, systematically taking apart a dishonest witness. She wasn't angry. She was focused. And Pam Bondi had just made the biggest mistake of her political career by underestimating her. "The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes," announced the chairman. As the chamber quieted down, all eyes turned to Congresswoman Crockett, who thanked the chair with remarkable composure considering Bondi's unprovoked attack. "Bondi," Crockett began, her voice measured and clear, "before I address the actual topic of this hearing, I feel compelled to correct some mischaracterizations you've made about my record and qualifications." Bondi's expression remained confident, even slightly amused, clearly expecting an emotional outburst that would reinforce her portrayal of Crockett as an inexperienced hothead. "You mentioned my limited time in Congress, suggesting I've accomplished nothing," Crockett continued. "I find it interesting that someone who has never served in Congress would feel qualified to judge congressional effectiveness. But let's talk about records and experience." Pocket picked up the first document from her folder. "While I've been working to protect voting rights, I couldn't help but review your tenure as Florida's Attorney General. Would you agree that an Attorney General's primary responsibility is to serve as the people's lawyer, not special interests?" Bondi shifted slightly. "Of course, I've always served the people of Florida faithfully." "That's interesting," Crockett replied, her tone unchanged but her eyes intensifying. "Because I have here documents showing that during your tenure, you received a $25,000 donation from Donald Trump's foundation just days before deciding not to join an investigation into Trump University. Would you care to explain that timing?" The chamber erupted. Republicans shouted irrelevant and out of order while Democrats leaned forward, suddenly riveted. Bondi's face flushed as the chairman struggled again to restore order. "That matter was fully addressed years ago," Bondi responded, her voice losing its casual confidence. "There was no connection between the donation and my office's decision. This is a desperate attempt to distract from your own lack of accomplishments." Crockett nodded patiently as if she'd expected this exact response. "I understand you feel that way. Let's move to another topic. You presented yourself today as a champion of election integrity. During your time as Attorney General, how many cases of actual voter fraud did your office prosecute?" Bondi hesitated, clearly unprepared for this line of questioning. "I don't have that specific number." "Would you be surprised to learn it was fewer than 5 cases in 8 years?" Crockett continued, holding up another document. "Meanwhile, your office declined to investigate multiple allegations of voter suppression affecting predominantly minority communities. Could you explain that priority decision?" The pattern continued for several minutes, Crockett methodically addressing each claim Bondi had made, countering with documented facts about Bondi's actual record. With each exchange, the dynamic in the room visibly shifted. Bondi's responses became increasingly defensive and less coherent, while Crockett maintained her composed prosecutorial approach. Halfway through her allotted time, Crockett pivoted. "Now, let's address the actual topic of today's hearing, election integrity. I have here a report from the Brennan Center showing that most claims of widespread voter fraud have been repeatedly debunked by courts, election officials from both parties, and independent researchers." She held up the report, then looked directly at Bondi. "Bondi, are you familiar with this research?" "I disagree with the Brennan Center's findings," Bondi replied, trying to regain her footing. Crockett's expression didn't change, but she reached for another document. "Are you also familiar with the statement from Trump's own cybersecurity chief, Christopher Krebs, who called the 2020 election the most secure in American history before being fired for telling this truth?" "That's his opinion," Bondi countered, her voice rising slightly. "And what about Attorney General William Barr's statement that there was no evidence of fraud at a level that would have changed the election outcome? Was that just his opinion too?" Crockett continued, her rhythm unbroken. The room had transformed. What Bondi had planned as an ambush was rapidly becoming her own political nightmare. Republican committee members began checking their phones, some leaving the chamber entirely to avoid the uncomfortable spectacle. Democrats watched with growing amazement as Crockett, without raising her voice or showing anger, systematically dismantled not just Bondi's attacks, but her entire credibility. Just as Bondi attempted to interrupt with a procedural objection, Crockett calmly raised a hand. "Ms. Bondi, I still have 1 minute remaining. I'd like to use it to address something important." The chairman nodded, and the room fell completely silent. "You came here today," Crockett said, her voice now carrying a weight that commanded attention, "not to discuss election integrity, but to attack me personally, perhaps believing that as a freshman representative, I would be an easy target. That was a miscalculation." She gathered her documents into a neat stack, her eyes never leaving Bondi's increasingly uncomfortable face. "The American people deserve representatives who will focus on solving real problems, not creating theatrical distractions. When you question my qualifications, you're not just attacking me. You're dismissing the voices of the 750,000 Texans who elected me to represent them. The chairman's gavel indicated her time was about to expire. "I yield back the remainder of my time," Crockett concluded, "and I suggest that in the future, M. Bondi, you come better prepared if you intend to question anyone's competence or commitment to public service." The chamber sat in stunned silence for a moment before erupting into chaos. The chairman desperately pounded his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Bondi, who had arrived as the experienced political operator, ready to put a freshman in her place, now sat visibly shaken, frantically whispering with her legal team, and the most dramatic confrontation was yet to come. The hearing continued with other committee members' questions, but the energy in the room had fundamentally changed. Republican representatives largely avoided engaging directly with Bondi, sticking to general talking points rather than risking another damaging exchange. Democratic members, sensing blood in the water, began asking increasingly pointed questions about Bondi's record and the inconsistencies Crockett had highlighted. Throughout it all, Congresswoman Crockett sat quietly observing, occasionally making notes, but otherwise maintaining the same composed demeanor. Those watching closely noticed she had positioned a single document apart from the others, a sealed envelope she hadn't yet referenced. 2 hours into the hearing, the chairman announced, "We'll now begin a second round of questioning with each member allocated 3 minutes. Congresswoman Crockett, you're recognized." The room immediately fell silent as Crockett thanked the chairman and adjusted her microphone. "Miss Bondi," she began, her tone respectful but firm, "earlier today you questioned my effectiveness as a representative and suggested I was simply, as you put it, an activist masquerading as a congresswoman. I'd like to take this opportunity to clarify some facts." Bondi nodded cautiously, clearly wary after their previous exchange. "In my first year in Congress," Crockett continued, "I've co-sponsored 27 bills, 5 of which have passed into law with bipartisan support. These include expanded healthcare access for veterans and increased funding for small businesses in underserved communities. Real accomplishments that improve Americans' lives." She looked down at her notes. "But more importantly, I've maintained direct engagement with my constituents, holding 32 town halls across my district, while many representatives hold none. Because unlike some in Washington, I believe elected officials should be accountable to the people they serve." The contrast with Bondi, who had never served in an elected legislative role, was obvious without Crockett having to state it explicitly. But she wasn't finished. "Now, Miss Bruni, let's return to the subject of election integrity, which you claim to champion. I have a simple question. Do you believe spreading unfounded claims about election fraud undermines Americans' confidence in our democratic processes?" Bondi shifted uncomfortably. "I believe we should investigate any credible allegations of irregularities." "That wasn't my question," Crockett replied calmly. "Let me be more specific. After the 2020 election, you appeared on multiple news programs questioning the results without evidence. On November 10, 2020, you stated, and I quote, "We have evidence of systemic fraud that will overturn these results." Do you stand by that statement today? The room tensed. Bondi glanced at her legal team, then responded cautiously. "I was conveying information I believed to be accurate at the time." Crockett nodded, then reached for the sealed envelope she had set aside. "I have here sworn affidavit from 3 former members of your staff who state that you privately acknowledge there was no credible evidence of widespread fraud." Even as you were making these public claims, a collective gasp swept through the chamber. Bondi's face drained of color as Crockett continued. "These individuals have agreed to testify under oath if necessary. They described specific conversations where you admitted the election claims were, in your words, legally indefensible, but politically necessary. Would you like to amend your previous statement?" Bondi's legal team immediately huddled around her, urgent whispers filling the momentary silence. When Bondi finally spoke, her voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "I would like to clarify that my statements were based on preliminary information that, yes or no, Miss Bondi?" Crockett interrupted, her voice still measured, but now carrying undeniable authority. "Did you knowingly promote claims about the 2020 election that you recognized were unsupported by evidence?" The committee room was completely silent, the tension almost unbearable. Bondi's legal advisor whispered something urgent in her ear, but she seemed frozen. "I was advocating for proper investigation of concerns raised by many Americans," she finally managed. Crockett let the non-answer hang in the air for a moment, then delivered the knockout blow. "Miss Dandy, I have here a transcript of your private remarks to donors at the Heritage Foundation dinner on February 18, 2021, where you stated, and I quote, Between us, the election fraud narrative is useful for fundraising, but we all know the legal cases are going nowhere. Would you like to explain that statement? To this committee, the chamber erupted into chaos. Democrats openly gasped while Republicans looked stunned and betrayed. The chairman pounded his gavel repeatedly, but the moment had transcended normal procedural control. Bondi, visibly shaken, turned to her legal team in panic. Her microphone caught her urgent whisper. How did she get that? That was a closed-door event. Crockett waited patiently as order was gradually restored. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet but carried throughout the silent room. Miss Bondi, you came here today questioning my qualifications and integrity. But it seems the real question is whether you have used claims you knew to be false to mislead the American people and undermine our democratic institutions for political and financial gain. She gathered her documents, looking directly at Bondi with an expression not of triumph, but of profound disappointment. The difference between us isn't experience or qualifications. It's that I believe public service is about honesty and accountability, not performance and personal advancement. You questioned whether I belong in Congress. I suggest the American people will question whether you should ever again claim to speak on their behalf. As Crockett yielded back her remaining time, the impact was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with clips of the exchange. Bondi exposed trending nationwide within minutes. News alerts lit up phones across the chamber as major. Networks interrupted regular programming to cover what was rapidly being called the most devastating congressional testimony. Takedown in modern political history. Bondi, once the confident accuser, now sat silently as her career and credibility crumbled in real time before a national audience. The remaining committee members, sensing the historic nature of what they just witnessed, largely declined their questioning time. When the chairman finally adjourned the hearing, Crockett rose calmly, gathered her materials, and walked out without looking back, leaving behind a politically destroyed Pam Bondi and a Washington landscape forever changed by what had just transpired. The aftermath of the Crockett-Bondi confrontation spread through Washington and beyond like a political tsunami. As Congresswoman Crockett exited the hearing room, she was met by a wall of reporters shouting questions, camera lights illuminating the corridor. Unlike most politicians who would seize such a moment for extended remarks, she simply stated, "Today we saw the difference between political theater and public service. I hope Americans reflect on which they want from their representatives," before continuing to her office. Inside the hearing room, Pam Bondi remained seated long after adjournment, surrounded by her increasingly concerned legal team. The C-SPAN cameras, still rolling, captured her stunned expression as aides frantically worked phones trying to develop a damage control strategy. When she finally rose to leave, reporters shouted questions about the donor transcript and staff affidavit, but Bondi hurried past without comment, her face a mask of barely contained panic. Within an hour, Crockett destroyed and Bondi exposed were the top trending topics nationwide. Video clips of the exchange spread across all platforms at unprecedented speed. A short clip of Crockett's final statement, "The difference between us isn't experience or qualifications. It's that I believe public service is about honesty and accountability," was viewed over 10 million times in the first 3 hours alone. Able news networks immediately rearranged their programming schedules. CNN's banner headline read, "Crockett Confrontation. Freshman rep exposed Bondi's election fraud contradictions." Even Fox News, typically sympathetic to Bondi, ran with explosive congressional hearing. Bondi faces serious allegations. The political fallout came swiftly and from all directions. By evening, the Heritage Foundation issued a statement distancing itself from Bondi, claiming the dinner referenced had been a casual event where many perspectives were shared and that they had no record of the specific remarks attributed to Miss Bondi. Political analysts noted the careful wording didn't actually deny the comments, only the foundation's responsibility for them. Several Republican senators who had previously worked closely with Bondi issued carefully worded statements expressing concern about the serious allegations raised and calling for full transparency. Behind the scenes, according to Cap Hill staffers, Republican leadership was in crisis mode, worried about how the revelations might affect ongoing election messaging and fundraising efforts. For Bondi personally, the consequences were immediate and severe. 3 conservative organizations where she held board positions announced she would be stepping down to address these concerns. A scheduled appearance on a prominent right-wing talk show was abruptly canceled. Her social media accounts went silent after a brief statement claiming Crockett's allegations were taken out of context and politically motivated, a response widely criticized for failing to specifically deny any of the documented quotes. The three former staffers referenced by Crockett remained anonymous, but their legal representation confirmed they stood ready to testify under oath if necessary. These individuals came forward at great personal and professional risk because they believe the American people deserve the truth. Their attorney stated in a press release that further damaged Bondi's already crumbling credibility. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's political stock soared overnight. Democratic leadership, which had previously viewed the freshman representative as promising but perhaps too outspoken, now recognized her exceptional political and strategic abilities. Morning shows competed for interviews, which Crockett largely declined, focusing instead on legislative work. "I didn't come to Washington to be a celebrity," she told the few reporters she briefly addressed. "I came to represent my constituents and uphold our democratic institutions." The impact extended far beyond the two individuals involved. Political scientists and media commentators began describing the confrontation as a potential inflection point in American politics, a moment when performance and personal attacks were overwhelmingly rejected in favor of factual accountability. "What we witnessed wasn't just one politician outmaneuvering another," noted a prominent political analyst on CNN's evening broadcast. "It was the triumph of preparation over performance, substance over style." Congresswoman Crockett didn't just win a political exchange. She demonstrated a different model of what political discourse could and should be. 3 days after the hearing, a detailed investigative piece by the Washington Post corroborated much of what Crockett had revealed, publishing additional evidence of Bondi's private contradictions of her public statements. The article cited multiple sources confirming Bondi had been part of strategy sessions, where the lack of election fraud evidence was openly acknowledged, even as public messaging continued to claim otherwise. In Crockett's Texas district, her office was flooded with supportive messages and invitations. Local news coverage was overwhelmingly positive, with one headline reading, "Texas Representative Shows Washington How It's Done." Her constituent approval rating jumped 15 points in post-hearing polling. For Bondi, the career implications appeared increasingly dire. Legal experts began discussing potential ethics violations and whether her contradictory statements could constitute perjury. The Florida Bar Association received multiple complaints requesting review of her law license based on potential violations of professional conduct standards. Former allies quickly created distance, with several claiming they had always had reservations about some of her more extreme positions. 1 week after the hearing, the House Ethics Committee announced a preliminary investigation into the allegations raised about deliberate misinformation being presented to the American public by a sworn witness. While Bondi wasn't a current government official, the committee's unusual steps signaled the seriousness with which Congress was treating the matter. Perhaps most significantly, a broader conversation began emerging about the responsibilities of public figures in maintaining democratic norms and institutions. Editorials across the political spectrum, while differing in their specific conclusions, largely agreed that Crockett had performed an important public service by exposing the cynical gap between private knowledge and public statements. "When history looks back at this period in American democracy," wrote a respected political historian in The Atlantic, "the Crockett-Bondi confrontation may be seen as a crucial moment when the tide began to turn against post-truth politics, not through matching hyperbole with hyperbole, but through the methodical evidence-based exposure of duplicity." 2 weeks after the hearing, Congresswoman Crockett finally gave a single in-depth interview to a respected political podcast. When asked if she had anticipated the enormous impact of her questioning, she smiled slightly. "My focus wasn't on creating a viral moment or advancing my career," she explained. "It was about standing up for truth and accountability, which are fundamental to a functioning democracy." Mon came to that hearing believing that political theater would triumph over substance. I still believe that the American people deserve and ultimately want better than that." She paused, then continued with conviction evident in her voice. "This isn't about partisan politics. It's about whether we as a nation still value truth, whether we still believe public officials should be held to basic standards of honesty and integrity." The response to that hearing suggests many Americans, regardless of political affiliation, are hungry for that kind of accountability. As the interview concluded, Crockett was asked about her future plans. Rather than the standard politician's deflection about focusing on current responsibilities, she answered with characteristic directness. "My plan is simple: to continue serving my constituents and our democracy with integrity and transparency, to prioritize truth over theatrics, to remember that I work for the American people, not for partisan advantage or personal advancement." And she smiled. If more of us in public life committed to those principles, imagine how much stronger our democracy would be. 3 months after the hearing, Pam Bondi had largely disappeared from public life, her credibility irreparably damaged. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, had translated her newfound national platform into successful bipartisan legislation addressing election security through increased funding for local election infrastructure, and enhanced transparency measures and ironic legacy for what had begun as Bondi's attempt to destroy her. The most lasting impact, however, was on political discourse itself. The Crockett Standard, as it came to be called by political observers, referred to the expectation that public figures could and should be held accountable for the consistency between their private acknowledgments and their public claims. In congressional hearings, television appearances, and campaign events, politicians increasingly faced versions of what became known as the Crockett question. Do your private statements match your public positions? What had begun as a calculated attack by a seasoned political operator against a freshman representative had transformed into a watershed moment in modern political history, a powerful reminder that in a healthy democracy, truth still matters, accountability still matters, and no amount of political theater can ultimately overcome the power of integrity backed by irrefutable evidence. Thanks for joining us for this remarkable story of political confrontation and accountability. If you found this analysis valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of the most significant moments in American politics. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on this historic exchange and what it means for the future of political discourse in our country. We'll see you in the next